Okay, this lecture is called Post-Feminism and Beyond, and it deals primarily with what I would now call the post-feminist decade, 1997 to 2007, which of course are also the Blair years. So my frame of reference is largely, but not exclusively, to the UK political culture of that period. But in the last section of the lecture, I will try to update and I will make some comments about the current coalition's response to women, to the female vote, and to the idea of a new kind of conservative feminism. So the lecture is divided into 3 sections. Last section deals with the last 5 years. First 2 sections are really in many ways a summary of some of the key elements of the argument that I have written about in the book The Aftermath of Feminism. So, okay, let me start then. And I want to start with some kind of initial comments about my observations as a feminist sociologist in the early 1990s, which led then to a more specific focus by the mid-1990s. My analysis really takes off to coincide with the election of the new Labour government. Okay, from the late 1990s, my attention as a feminist sociologist kept being drawn to media images which were intended to provoke some imagined group of always humourless feminists. These images appeared in a celebratory fashion to reverse the clock, to turn the clock back to some earlier pre-feminist moment, while at the same time doing so in a rather tongue-in-cheek kind of way. The prevailing use of irony seemed to exonerate the culprits, that is to say the people producing these images, from the crime of offending against what was caricatured as a kind of extreme and usually always man-hating feminism, while at the same time acknowledging that other, more acceptable forms of feminism had by now entered into the realms of common sense and were broadly acceptable. The famous Hello Boys Wonderbra billboard advertisement was the most obvious example of this. The rhetoric of this image proposed the deviant pleasure of being politically incorrect with force and energy. The old feminist was addressed implicitly as a woman who sought to limit the pleasures of the rest of us. Thank goodness, the image seemed to suggest, we can now, once again, enjoy looking at the bodies of beautiful women with impunity. So skillful with the use of postmodern irony was the image that it also sought to produce a kind of generational divide. The younger female viewer is not made angry, unlike her older counterpart. She appreciates the multiple layers of meaning and she gets the joke. Since then, this new kind of sophisticated anti-feminism has become a recurring feature across the landscape of both popular and political culture. Its distinctive feature is that it upholds the principles of gender equality while denigrating the figure of the feminist. From the gentle upbraiding of the feminist in the film Bridget Jones's Diary, to the rise of lap dancing clubs, to the sexist, in inverted comma, jokes of Ricky Gervais, Russell Brand, Jonathan Ross, to hen parties, to the proliferation of lads' mags, to the sexualisation of small girls through the rise of fashion and beauty brands targeted at the under fives, to the retro-styled garden barbecue event staged for the Obama visit in the summer of 2011, which had in the foreground the wives dressed for the part and hence traditionally wifely. Finally, through all of that, to the spectacular and unapologetic hate speech we came to associate with Berlusconi, who nevertheless also claimed to support the careers and ambitions of young, glamorous women, while also showering older women who challenged him with torrents of verbal abuse. With all of this, I argued we could see something socially significant solidify under the surface of contemporary cultural life. And I refer to this phenomenon as a form of symbolic power, which can be understood as post-feminist. there is a double entanglement across the socio-political universe as feminism is taken into account in order that it can be understood as having passed away. What once may have had some role to play on the political stage is no longer needed. Feminism is associated with the past and with old and unglamorous women. For example, Germaine Greer in the UK, Alice Schwarzer in Germany. And this encourages, this association with old and unglamorous women, with your mum or your granny, etc., encourages a sharp disidentification with feminism on the part of young women. Through the first decade of the 21st century, it was a mark of the cultural intelligibility of young women that they renounce or disavow the need for a new sexual politics. They were expected to refrain from gender critique and to become quiet and quiescent. This marks what I call the complexification of backlash. Susan Faludi referred in her book to backlash, and I saw a complexification of backlash precisely because post-feminism registers time and again the seeming gains and successes of the second wave of the women's movement, the fact that things have changed, and hence of the irrelevance of a new feminism. Now, of course, we might ponder and wonder why this has happened. Whereas, an obvious question would be, well, how did this happen? How did it come that feminism came to be taken into account in this way? And we could look at the work of the French sociologists Boltanski and Chapello, and they've provided a wide-ranging analysis of the way in which the contemporary capitalism has replenished itself, producing for itself a new spirit which substitutes old bureaucratic modes with a more flexible kind of capitalism, and it does this by taking on board many of the criticisms levered by the left, especially those associated with the student movement of the 60s and the 70s. That's what Boltanski and Chapello say. They make no mention of feminism there, I have to say. However, it would be possible to extend their argument to include some of the critiques provided by second wave feminism. Indeed, we find this being suggested recently by Nancy Fraser, who states that there is, as she puts it, a disturbing convergence of feminism with the new brand of neoliberal capitalism. Nancy Fraser sees an unwitting collusion on the part of feminism here, which, she argues, had, by the time at which neoliberalism was on the ascendant, feminism had, if you like, she argues, lost its touch with material issues like inequality and had become merely cultural. And she says this then allows feminism to be taken into account and taken on board because it's no longer got that hard, sharp emphasis on inequality and poverty. Nancy Fraser posits a connection, therefore, between feminism at a moment when it had relinquished some of its hard-edged critical stance on inequality, and she associates then this with the rise of neoliberalism, which, as with Boltanski and Chapello, was now reaping the rewards from its incorporation of various forms of critique offered by the cultural wing of the cultural counterculture of the late 60s and 70s. So you could see that Fraser is suggesting that alongside the way in which neoliberal capitalism took on board the critique of the left radicals of the counterculture, maybe it was also able to do the same with feminism. Like myself, Nancy Fraser recognises that Western feminism, in a popular vein, had indeed entered into everyday life, especially around a set of values which appeared to challenge and contest visible inequalities and injustices. But I would say she underplays the way in which capitalism actively sought to undo feminism. So that's where we really differ. I saw capitalism at this moment, in the transition from capitalism to neoliberal capitalism, I saw there being a ferocious attack on feminism, which is what I meant by feminism undone. Whereas Nancy Fraser, in effect, says feminism let itself be undone, or feminism let itself be taken on and taken up by neoliberal capitalism. And I would really disagree with that. I think feminism was subjected to a ferocious undermining by neoliberal capitalism. That's at the heart of my argument. So she underplays the way in which capitalism actively sought to undo feminism. There is nothing new in her argument which documents the sustained undermining of both feminism and feminists. She makes it sound as though there was simply a convergence, an unexpected liaison. In contrast, I argued forcefully in the aftermath of feminism that a new gender regime comes into being which directly acts upon the bodies and the capacities of young women. The world of media imagery and the politics of meaning are deeply and inextricably connected to and part of the wider political economy. It was through the intersection of popular and political culture that feminism was undone, and hey presto was instead replaced by a prevailing, even triumphant, discourse of female individualism, informed by a veneer of feminist principles and a whole set of buzzwords like choice, empowerment, top girls, A1 girls, and so on, which could then be easily set to work as part of an emerging neoliberal agenda, this time addressed entirely to, indeed customised for young women. So that's the argument around Boltanski and Chappello and Nancy Fraser. If we want to understand this in more depth, we could also look at the work of the Italian neo-Marxists and people writing around the Hart and Negri circles. And it's just interesting for a second to reflect on their argument, because what they offer a much more optimistic account. You know, they say that capitalism was really taken by surprise, and that capitalism was undermined, and in many ways the force of the left critique meant that capitalism had to make some concessions. So their argument is much more optimistic. They say that the countercultural critique, the history of the left, in all of its various forms of radicalism, actually did have an impact on capitalism. And they sum it up in terms of the way in which there was, as they put it, a refusal of work. They said the working class. Actually, they mean the male working class. They said that the young male working class was participating in a kind of refusal of work. It didn't want to see the whole life ahead of them in terms of just simply being a routine, mundane person on the factory floor. So they talk about how capitalism was really taken aback and had to give some concessions. Now, I've already written in another paper a really long critique of Hart and Negri on the issue of gender. What I think is worth saying now is that, let me put it another way. Is it possible to say that capitalism likewise was taken aback by the ferocity of the feminist movement? Did feminism really mount a major challenge to capitalism, forcing it to retreat or forcing it to make some concessions? And this, again, is an immensely complex and interesting area for discussion, where you could see, yes, there was legislation, there was some degree of incorporation, some feminists were listened to, others weren't. I think the best way of answering that question in a quick way is to say that women were allowed, indeed encouraged, to pursue economic independence. Now, whether we see that as a concession or whether we see it as a victory of feminism is, we could argue that one way or another. Perhaps it's a bit of both. That is to say, the kind of settlement that emerged out of second wave feminism in the Western world was that young women were suddenly encouraged not just to invest all their future hopes in marriage and consequently being destined to being economically dependent. There was the possibility through second wave feminism of earning your own living and therefore achieving a degree of economic independence. So we could say, if we wanted to, through the language of Hart and Negri, that employers took feminism into account, but they did so in widely diverse ways across different sectors, and also very much to the advantage of middle-class, high-achieving women and not working-class women, who were still both employed in routine, mundane jobs, also underpaid, and so probably still economically dependent. I would say that in relation to the Hart and Negri argument, we need to look closely at the ways and means by which feminism came to be translated into a vocabulary of so-called female empowerment in the workplace. So we need to look a lot more closely at this process and how it happened. Okay, that's the end of the introduction to this presentation. I'm going to stop just for a second to have a sip of my cup of tea and move on to the second part. And the second part is where I rehearse my own argument in more detail, and it's called Political Culture, Popular Culture and Young Women. So, if young women then suddenly emerged in the mid-1990s, in the moment after which feminists of my generation had devoted such huge amounts of energy to challenging gender stereotypes in secondary schools, gender stereotypes in nurseries, gender stereotypes in the media, if then, by the mid-1990s, government was, if you like, coming on board, if that's the case, then let's look at how it happened and what the consequences were. So I would say that the scale of this undertaking, which really in many ways constitutes a kind of remaking of modern young womanhood, so as to suggest that feminism has been taken into account. I would say this required the active participation of the media and popular culture. So government needed the media to do this. It couldn't do it by itself. Now here we run into, of course, all sorts of questions about how to avoid an analysis which simply focuses in a rather mechanical way on the power of the press and media and women's magazines on one hand, and the power of government on the other hand. And I, of course, want to avoid a mechanical kind of argument, because a mechanical argument merely sets one powerful apparatus alongside another, each with an agenda which may or may not coincide. I would say it's altogether much more instructive to examine the complex intersections and flows of media and political discourses which spread, sometimes intersecting in unpredictable ways, far and wide across the social fabric. So, looked at in this more broadly Foucauldian way, we can see the emergence of similar mobilizing vocabularies and clusters of expressions and ideas. And the sociologist Nicholas Rose subjected the whole grammar of the new Labour government to close examination, seeing there a new focus on self-reliance, on the conduct of conduct, on individualisation, on self-entrepreneurship, on talent and competition. And following this, the argument I proposed in the aftermath of feminism was that within the passage to a new form of neoliberal governmentality, young women came to occupy a key position. Indeed, they became exemplary subjects. Under this new gender regime, the subjectivities of young women are defined and described in a repetitive manner in popular and political discourses along the lines of female individualisation. This permits a replacement for feminism through stressing not collectivity or the concerns of women per se, but rather competition, ambition, the meritocracy, self-help, and the rise of the so-called alpha girl, much loved by the Daily Mail. The young woman is addressed as a potential subject of great capacity. As Anita Harris puts it in her book, the alpha girl is a can-do girl. and in a proliferation of faux feminist gestures, girls are applauded and celebrated and supported for their potential and for what they can do in the world. Across the field of corporate culture, initiatives to support the global girl become a mark of compassion and concern, as well as ethical responsibility. And underlying this spotlight of what Deleuze would call a luminosity is a subtle process of marketization, wherein the potential of younger women comes to be harnessed to the idea of, so-called, very nebulous idea of consumer citizenship, a term which was much bandied about during the New Labour years. This activity on the part of government, designed to give a bigger place to consumer culture in the politics of everyday life, marked out not just a recognition of the power of media and popular culture to forge a world of cohesive values, but also a neoliberal strategy for offloading the work of government into a more self-regulating terrain, whereby the market is given more leeway to shape the needs of the population, in this case young women. Then, as we've seen from some recent examples, when things go a bit too far, government will step back in to pull the free market forces back into line. And the example I'm thinking about is the public debate that took place just a few months ago, which was undertaken by David Cameron himself, which tackled the subject of the sexualisation of childhood. Actually, when he's talking about the sexualisation of childhood, it is a feminist issue because it's a gender issue. He's not really talking about the sexualisation of young boys through fashion. He's actually talking about little girls aged 6 shopping and seeing that they can, if they want to, buy a push-up bra, or looking at the makeup counters in Boots, which have become so normal, we're so used to it, to pampering for 7-year-old girls that we hardly notice it. So I would say it's a feminist issue. He took it up as an issue for parents concerned about the sexualisation of childhood. Anyway, that's what happens when the free market is absolutely unregulated, and there are people sitting in marketing departments thinking, oh, how can we find a new market? Why not encourage little girls once again, as they did in the 50s, to just think about dolls and bodies and makeup and so on and so forth. So it's kind of retrospective free market exploitation of gender and sexuality. Okay, so my focus of interest in the aftermath of feminism was in what I termed a new sexual contract. This was a hegemonic process aimed at what Stuart Hall would call a kind of gender settlement regarding the status and identity of young women. They were to be, this is what the sexual contract was, they were to be encouraged to achieve at school, at university and in the world of work, and in each of these spheres they could rightly expect norms of gender equality to prevail. Government would, at that time, 1997 to 2007, provide supports and incentives to do well, to gain high qualifications and to aim for financial independence, for example, a monthly salary. The figure of Bridget Jones is exemplary here. This economic independence marked a shift away from dependence on the male breadwinner model. Does the male breadwinner disappear? Is that the success of feminism? And with this economic independence, there was the promise to women of greater freedom, while also, ideally, of course, taking the burden away from the state following marriage, breakdown or divorce. That is to say, access to wage earning capacity and to economic independence also benefited the state. In the likelihood of marriage breaking down, women still could earn their own living. So that was part of the contract, if you like. The young woman could also expect, as a result of her enthusiasm for work and for a career, to gain some tangible sexual freedoms in the form of access to leisure culture, to a sex life which need not be tied to marriage and having children, and to a climate where the sexual double standard was to be lifted so that young women could heartily enjoy sexuality with impunity. Indeed, the girl could also now get as drunk as she liked, knock back 3 bottles of vodka, behave badly within certain limits. And we can see this, of course, in Bridget Jones, where she falls out of a taxi onto the pavement, drunk after having 2 bottles of Chardonnay, etc. As long, however, there were conditions, as long as she did not become a single mother who would be reliant on welfare and benefits, she could gain access to sexual pleasures which in the past had been the privilege of men. Hence, the new female market for self-pornography and the growth of so-called porn chic. And I call this, if you like, this model of a more free female sexuality, a kind of phallic girl, in that the young woman, the young free, sexually independent young woman is phallic because she has been allowed to emulate some of the privileges in the past associated only with men and masculinity. So she can become a kind of phallic girl. She can be one of the boys, although of course she still looks absolutely like one of the girls. And indeed the irony of the phallic girl is, you know, the question, what are the conditions of being a phallic girl, of being able to go out and drink and throw up and, you know, dance naked and, you know, take your top off and whatever. Of course, it's without judgment as long as you are a young phallic girl. You know, you couldn't be an old phallic girl, and then of course all the old recriminatory labels would come back into, you know, she's an old tart or she's an old slapper. So actually being a phallic girl is completely associated with having a certain kind of desirable female body. So it might be phallic, but it's also still very normative in relation to femininity. Okay. The new sexual contract, then, to sum up, tied women to enjoying the freedom to consume, having earned her own wage, and this of course gave rise to a huge expansion during that decade of the female consumer culture market. You know, bags, you know, spending £300 in a bag. Grazia magazine is a kind of window for consumer culture. And indeed you could see Grazia as, if you like, the kind of front piece, the kind of spokeswoman for the Blair decade. Obviously that's past now, but Grazia, if you like, came to life in this moment. What was completely omitted across all of this was encouragement to a more active form of political participation. That is to say, the sexual contract was economic at heart. It was about earning enough money to be independent and then spending the money on yourself, and then instead of doing anything like feminist activity, instead of having any concern for the community or for children or for improving the neighbourhood or for standing as a local MP, for example, or standing as a local councillor in your free time, the young woman was encouraged just to self-perfect in her free time. That is to say, to go to the gym. So when you're not working, when you're not dating, like Carrie in Sex and the City, where are you? You're in the gym, making yourself even more perfect and beautiful. So there was a kind of refusal of politics at that moment. And that's why I said there was a de-democratisation in and through the Blair years. And there was certainly a refusal to even countenance the idea of a renewed sexual politics, never mind the diminishing of the field of formal politics per se. So grassroots or community politics were completely downgraded in the context where self-improvement and the need for constant makeovers were considered the best kind of extracurricular activities for young women. Okay, that takes us to the end of the Blair period and the moment of which I said was profoundly post-feminism. So my reading of post-feminism was that it was profoundly anti-feminist. It was a political discourse and a popular discourse which repudiated feminism, which found it distasteful. And people will remember, certainly people who were around in the UK at this time, the way in which Tony Blair was often quoted as being somebody who could not abide the F word. You know, it gave him a sort of shiver of distaste. And this, of course, made it all the more unpalatable for younger women to identify with. I think things have changed, I have to say. I think my book chronicles that period, but I think since then things have changed. There has been a renewal of feminist activity in the last 5 years, or maybe even just in the last 3 years. and this takes all kinds of diverse forms, particularly it's internet-led, but I do think that there has been a change and a return of a certain kind of feminism. Maybe partly as a result of the recognition of this sheer force of hostility. Also, I think young women have just begun recently to refuse that kind of quietness and that kind of silence in relationship to lap dancing or the new mainstreaming of pornography. So I think I was charting a moment that was politically important, but which now has, thank goodness in some ways, changed. And so I'll just conclude this with making some comments about the coalition government in the UK and the kind of return to sexual politics that they envisage, and indeed the kind of new feminism associated with the Tory party. So I think we've just got about 5 minutes or so. Is that all right? Am I okay? Okay. So this is called After Post-Feminism, UK Coalition Gender Politics. With the coalition government, is it still running okay? Headed by David Cameron, we witnessed something quite different. Granted, he has a modern wife, and his public image suggests that he is a hands-on father in an equal partnership, now a recognised trope of modern coupledom, with his wife. But under the surface, and taken unawares, he betrays his own total unfamiliarity as a die-hard conservative with what feminism has meant in political life. And we know this because he referred in the House of Commons not long ago to Labour MP Angela Eagle in a derogatory way, calling her my dear. He said, "Oh, calm down, my dear," in the House of Commons, which of course then gave rise to, thank goodness, to various forms of intervention, challenge and criticism. But in saying, "calm down, my dear," he showed just how intact and unchanged it seems sexual hierarchies are within the present government. Likewise, Michael Goves, the Minister for Education, in a recent BBC Newsnight programme about the riots of 2011, found himself repeatedly referring to his opponent, the Labour Deputy Leader, Harriet Harman, by her first name as Harriet, or "Dear Harriet," or "Oh, but Harriet." He did this so many times that it became visible to all who were watching, including myself, as an unmistakable and old-school Oxford Union way of reducing a substantial female politician to, symbolically at least, the status of an over-enthusiastic schoolgirl. And then if we also acknowledge the statements by the Justice Minister, Kenneth Clarke, regarding the seeming disparity between different levels of seriousness of rape, which he was very reluctant to retract and only eventually apologised for. And then finally, if we consider the claim by the Minister for the Universities, David Willits, in his book The Pinch, that where he claims that the lack of social mobility in contemporary Britain is partly accounted for because so many middle-class girls, thanks to feminism, have taken advantage of the expansion of university places at the expense of men, and particularly working-class boys, then if we take all of these odd comments, taken for granted, off-the-cuff comments, inside the Conservative Party, actually we can see how much ground is lost to women when active feminism goes into abeyance, as it has done, as it did during the Blair years. So without a strong and vocal women's movement, with all the factions and disputes, the clock does indeed seem to turn backwards. So the clock seemed to turn backwards when Kenneth Clarke talked about, different kinds of rape, different levels of seriousness and so on. I'm reluctant to use this metaphor of progress because it suggests a kind of unilinear notion of feminist time. Nevertheless, it's hard to avoid that, where we see new permutations of domestic violence, such as the rise of so-called boyfriend violence, and, surprise, surprise, when there are attempts to undo the terms and conditions of women's reproductive freedoms. See Nadine, I've forgotten her second name, Dorinder, around the question of abortion. Concurrent with this, And within the frames, however, of a modern post-feminism, where feminism has been taken into account, there is an instrumentalisation at the same time of sexual politics by Western governments as they address then other less progressive regimes. So we see that women indeed have won their freedom. They can dress as they please. They can enjoy pornography if that is their choice. They are now empowered and they can fall drunk out of taxis without repercussions. That is the governmental instrumentalisation of feminism, and it's then used to, if you like, castigate less progressive regimes, for example, Muslim governments, for their treatment of women. Okay, let me conclude then this update on the question of post-feminism with one final consideration. This again concerns the UK coalition government. There are changes here which suggest the forging of a more explicit conjoining of neoliberal policies, if not with feminism, then with the idea of modern womanhood, wherein, yet again, everything hinges around the idea of personal choice. Here we see, and this is what I mean about the last, it's really just in the last year. Here we see an avowal rather than a disavowal of the successful, high-achieving woman who also is often a mother, who can rise to power within the Conservative Party, and even on occasion when pressed, she can even call herself a feminist. I'm thinking obviously of Louise Mensch. And unlike Mrs. Thatcher, this new Conservative feminist is no longer completely unique and exceptional. In this space, we do indeed find young women like the MP Louise Mensch, formerly, interestingly, a best-selling chick-lit novelist, as well as a PR for the music industry, now a mother of 3 and a politician. This image of female success, and she is without doubt an alpha, a super alpha girl, a triple alpha girl, indicates a breakthrough into the social and political elite for women who are, by and large, already extremely privileged. So what I'm saying is that what Tory feminism means is a breakthrough into the male elite for women who are already very much top girls, the possibility of that. Interviews describe Louise Mensch's wealthy family and her private education, as well as a very successful ex-husband and an equally wealthy current husband. She is not alone in the cohort of young women who have emerged within the Conservative Party whose upper middle class background, along with an Oxbridge education, makes them exemplars of female capacity. The top girls, celebrated and supported in the UK by New Labour in its years of government, not the feminists, the top girls, have now, in fact, found political homes for themselves within the centre-right as elite women. So top girls become elite women. Across the spectrum of European politics, it is the small super league of polished professional women who gain prominence from their prestigious jobs. So far removed are they from ordinary women, they might as well be celebrities, really. That's the reality. They are so far removed, this super league, and actually they appear in the same magazines as the celebrities, often alongside them. They function more then as role models, issuing a clarion call to young women that you can do it. In strictly neoliberal terms, they act as benchmarks, they're kind of measuring devices. These political high flyers function then as measuring devices against which young women can gauge their own performances and confront their own failings. So their failings, as Ulrich Beth famously put it, are biographical failings to structural contradictions. They become a space of calculation, these role models, by proposing the question, because these role models become a space of calculation. They pose the question, what does it take to get from where I am to where you are? Or what does it take to get from where you are to where I am? And in some ways, I would say that figureheads like Michelle Obama, who does very good and important work, nevertheless, I cannot feel that she really can speak to the genuinely disadvantaged black girl in London. Her constituency, you can only be an effective role model for people who are already within your radar. Yeah? for whom it is a realistic, who are already on course to achieve great things. So even though Michelle Obama makes these great steps to, when she visits London, to visit girls in a rundown comprehensive with social disadvantage all around them, nevertheless, the image of Michelle Obama in the gym at 4 o'clock in the morning, you know, in her J. Crew outfits, always saying, you can do it. Who is she talking to? She's talking to those who are, if you like, within spitting distance of being able to do it. So, to sum up, I've argued here that the logic of post-feminism is to sustain and develop further a call to young women which would have them emulate the new female international elite, borrowing directly from the corporate language of the fashion and beauty complex and the whole apparatus of the commercial feminine media, and adding to this a normatively middle-class idea of achievement, ambition and professionalism, at the cost, once again, of the category of the political. Okay, you can turn it off.